Hi, folks. It's Thinking Slow. We wanted to do a quick wrap up of what's been happening in globalism in the last week or so. And it's relatively important because there's just been the World Economic Forum just finished. And last week also was the Bilderberg meeting. So just give you a heads up of what we think is really important that we can share here and how it plays into our Great Resist agenda. The first thing is there's a huge amount of noise everywhere, and we might try and do this report weekly because it's very difficult to filter out the signal from the noise. Probably 97% of what we see in the media is really irrelevant to the key things that are going on at the moment, and what's going on at the moment is enormous government overreach and the implementation of this Great Reset, and we think we should only really focus on things that impact that and find ways to stop it, and everything else is just noise, basically. That's why we put this together. So the first big thing that happened was the Bilderberg meeting happened last week, and we're going to have a look through some of the key participants in the meeting. So the only thing they disclose are the agenda items, which are here on the left. We don't need to go into them. That's just a list of sort of current important topics and who was attending. So let's have a look at the attendees, because I think it gives you some insight into how these globalist bodies really work and how they probably are much more responsible for setting policies than our national governments are. So here is the list of participants. We're not going to go through each one because it's about 120 odd names, but the main background to this is what we're seeing quite a lot now. This is the coming together of sectors or activities in the economy that we'd usually think of as being separate, and they're being merged together. So in this grouping, you're seeing the media coming together with politicians, coming together with big business, coming together with the military ministries and spying agencies. So I think in many ways this is a very unhealthy combination of groupings that in many ways should be separated. You'd expect one to be providing oversight over another, but it's not happening now. This is merging into this sort of one world government, and the only people that really are not represented here are any kind of what I would call genuine civil society. So you have this sort of fake civil society which is set up and funded by oligarchy, but the real sort of grassroots organizations, libertarians, are completely excluded from this kind of talking shop. So firstly, on the media side, you have all the usual fans of globalization here. So the Atlantic, the Economist, and the FT. And funnily enough, if you didn't know, The Economist is owned by the Rothschild, or partially owned by Rothschild families and the Agnellis, which is something we only found out recently. So they're very much on for this globalization agenda. And I wanted just to point out three specific names on this whole list. You can look at it because the link is at the bottom here of the slide. But we found a couple of interesting things here. One of them is the way that these organizations hedge their bets. So you've got here, for example, David Lammy, who's the shadow Secretary of State, who's a Labour Party member in Parliament. And at the same meeting, you have Tom Tugendhat, somewhere in here. Yeah, there we go, Tom Tugendhat, and he's the Conservative who is actually at the moment the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee. So this is quite typical of these globalist organizations, that they hedge their bets so that they have a sort of finger on the pulse of UK foreign policy, no matter who's in charge, and that this seems to be quite typical. And Tom Tugendhat is famously the guy that said, expel Russian citizens, all of them, to defend our interests, to defend the British people. So he's talking about getting rid of every single Russian from the UK That is actually the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing, and he is an extremely unpleasant individual, would be my guess, and so it's not really surprising to find him here. But I guess the important thing is the Reds and the Blues, the Labours and the Conservatives, whatever game is being played politically, they're both at this meeting. So, you're really, are we looking at the illusion of choice is what I'm trying to say for party politics. So there's probably only one other organisation that would like to focus in on here, which is this Centre for European Policy Analysis. And as we mentioned in other material, this has been far-out warmongers have been writing from the accounts of SEPA. One of them is Olga Tokaryuk, who's been covered in some of our other videos, and another one is Anders Ostlund. That's not Ostlund, who's another guy. This is Ostlund, Ostlund, another person. But these are ultra far-out warmongers. They were the ones calling for much, much greater NATO involvement, no-fly zones, regime change in Russia, doing anything and everything to avoid getting into any kind of negotiations on peace, or even ceasefire. So this is the kind of group that are here at this meeting. It's well worth looking through this, and in our view, these bodies have a lot more to do with setting our political agendas and policies than in-country national politicians. So as we said, in 2020, this felt a bit out there when we put this diagram together, but you do have these different groups across big business over here, the neo-Marxists, the World Economic Forum resetters, the radical Greens. They all agree on one thing, which is they have a top-down view of how the world should be, and our rights as citizens get in the way of implementing their visions. So they all agree that sort of constitutional constraints should be done away with, and personal liberty should be done away with, and we should be collectivized and have their, I would say in many cases, perverse plans implemented on us. So looking at the attendance list of Bilderberg and looking at what we've seen in the other videos, I think this idea is now becoming more credible, that actually the people and our sort of constitutional rights get squashed. So let's move on. So Bilderberg was a big thing that happened this week. This was a very, very big panel from the World Economic Forum that didn't really get that much coverage. So the first thing I'd like to point out is that they're wringing their hands here and crying about equity. So, everybody in the world should have equal access to medical treatments. Now, you must remember, these are the same people, or associated with the people, who squashed all of the early treatment protocols for COVID. And those early treatment protocols involved antivirals that cost nothing because they were off patent. So when they're wringing their hands, crying about having access for all for medical treatment, just remember that means access to the vaccine, which is much, much more expensive than antivirals. So that's the first thing. There in our view is quite a big level of hypocrisy off the bat. There were two other big acknowledgements made here by Mr. Gates. One is that the vaccines don't prevent transmission, and he sort of giggled as he was saying that. And then, of course, related to that is that vaccine passports don't make any sense, because if you've been vaccinated and you're still infected, then obviously the vaccine passport doesn't really tell you anything, so it doesn't make any scientific sense. And that's something he said pretty clearly at this round table that hasn't really been covered. And so also in relation to vaccine passports, this advertising for a job was spotted on Twitter and circulated out. So this is a job with the UK Department of Health about the delivery of the COVID pass. And the job, well, it's just being advertised now in 2022, and it'll run to 2023. So everyone's sort of up in arms. Well, we were told there wouldn't be a COVID pass, so what's the job all about? I wanted to make clear that the sort of electronic vaccine passport is in the World Health Organization plan for the pandemic treaty, and nobody's given that up. And I put this little chart together that, whatever the excuse that's provided, the agenda item is always the same. I think everybody in government for the last 15 years at least has been looking for a way to provide electronic identity to their citizens, and they understand perfectly well that once that's been given, you can then deny access to services very simply through a push of a button. And whatever excuse they give you, and I've put in a few, it can be national security, regional security, global pandemic, national pandemic, efficiency, on and on. The excuses change, but the agenda item always remains the same. Electronic identification for each citizen, and therefore with that comes the government's ability to punish anyone and everyone at the press of a button. And that's the real issue. Another interesting item this week was gaslighting from Mike Graham on Talk Radio and Talk TV, where a caller came in and expressed concern about Bill Gates's influence over the World Health Organization. And that's a very valid concern, because individuals putting in large amounts of money into organizations that set health policy, that's a question mark, and something we've been looking at in other videos. What is the level of influence of oligarchs over public policy? It's a completely valid question. So rather than answer that question from the caller, John, Mike Graham just seeks to humiliate him. These are not Satanists and so on and so forth. But this is classic gaslighting, because they don't want you asking questions like this and looking at who's funding what and how much money is going around, which is what we're doing. And then the last item for the week is getting ready to take guns away from people in Chile. Just very quickly, this is a fairly radical far-left politician covered in tattoos with a radical agenda coming up. So taking away guns, coincidentally, is also happening in Canada, and they're looking at it in America. And that policy will be implemented by another Davos young global leader, this lady Isquia Siches, who is the Minister of Interior in Chile. So as the World Economic Forum likes to boast, they have people in every cabinet, and Chile is no exception. So it's quite often been the case in history that taking guns away from citizens has been a precursor to some fairly draconian oppression. And looking at this guy's CV, I wouldn't be surprised if that was going to happen again in Chile. So those were really the main stories of the week. Much of what we're doing is about this great reset that, however well-intentioned it is, and I'm not even convinced it is well-intentioned, these utopian visions, when they're implemented on a top-down basis, they require the destruction of civil liberties in order to be implemented, and they inevitably turn into a total and utter nightmare for basically everybody. We're into year 2 of Build Back Better, massive inflation, food shortages, and they keep going with this digital oppression, and I think this is the reality of what this great reset's going to look like. So we're very much opposed to it. We've put together this great resist, which is really just a very short summary of things that can be done, because you can be overwhelmed by all the attacks on liberty coming from every single angle every day. And as I said at the beginning, much of the news is irrelevant in our view. Well north of 90% is irrelevant. So, we're looking at 3 things basically, which is getting rid of the neo-Marxist attack, or which is called training, which is being rolled out throughout the state institutions, the BBC, civil service, universities. All that has to stop. They have to, by law, be politically neutral, and indoctrination has basically been presented as training, and it's happening all the time. And I think people are getting wise to that. So that needs to stop. The culture needs to be left alone. It can't be destroyed through this so-called training. The main issue, of course, is government overreach, which is what I hinted about at the Great Reset. These guys don't see any limits whatsoever to their powers, and whatever their limits there are should be swept away. And this is not the kind of people you want in power. You want people in power who respect the constitutional boundaries and the liberties of individuals. And one obvious area to get to for overreach would be getting rid of the completely unethical applied psychology being used by the government through nudge units, through the Spy B, and we suspect 77th as well. All of that has to stop. And then the last part is the merger of state and business, which we've covered, and means getting out of these incestuous relationships through the WEF and other forums. And then lastly, specifically what we're working on now is the WHO. We think that treaty is going ahead. There's a lot of disinformation out there that it isn't. It is going ahead, and the next round of consultations is now. We think the consultation process is completely skewed anyway. It's just window dressing, but we want to spend a fair bit of time trying to oppose this, because it's clearly heading in the direction of creating one world government, and also, as we said before, the sixth carbon budget should essentially be ripped up for the UK. The government should stick to regulating taxes, but not telling you whether you can eat meat or you can't eat meat. That's none of their business. And then if you want to help us with that, please join us on Patreon. We've had new joiners in the last week or so, which has been good. And please join in with them and help us on this mission. Thank you. Stay free. Bye.